Welcome to Take on Health from Pub Health TV. Today I'm joined by Ellen G. Morgan, a health writer and author of Sunset Angels, a guide written to support new hospice nurses. We'll talk about the inspiration behind your book, the emotional and professional challenges of hospice work, and the role of writing in healthcare. Ellen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Arion, for having me today. It's
Sure.
great to be here.
Thank you for being willing to talk about the book you've had and that you've been working on
Mhm.
for several years. So, before we dive deeper into the challenges of hospice nursing, I'd love to start with the heart of your book. Sunset Angel serves as a guide for new hospice nurses. What inspired you to write it, and what do you hope it offers to those entering the hospice field?
It came out of the frustration of orienting new hospice nurses when I was a RN case manager. And so many have left. And I thought if they knew the background of what it takes to be a good hospice nurse, then maybe they would stay. It's like the fear of the unknown. So I just wanted to be a mentor in a book and help them navigate through the time of orientation and beyond, and just encourage them to stick with it because it's going to get better. The beauty of hospice is not apparent in the beginning. It can be really hard work when you first start it because you're dealing with your own fears and anxieties of doing the work. But after a while, you will get into a rhythm and your hospice team will get to know you and vice versa. Working as a team, that takes time. And then dealing with patients, hospice nurses or nurses in general already know how to do that. But there is an art of hospice nursing. So hopefully this book will explain what that is and just give them a taste of what their work is going to be like.
When you say that you wrote the book to support them in the preparation for hospice nursing, I think it's the biggest misconception or what's throwing them off when they start.
I think just dealing with death, because it's not something that a nurse wants to normally do because we got in there to help and nurture and heal. In hospice, the longer that you're in it, you will find there is healing. It's just a different type of healing. And the intimidation of dealing with death and dying, because that's the ultimate outcome. It is death. But having a good death is what's desirable, a peaceful passing, and that's pain free. That's all the family asks of you. And a good experience, which doesn't always happen. For the most part, you do want to promote that.
So you touched on how much hospice nurses get emotionally, spiritually, and mentally, yet they often don't have the space to process their own struggle. And people say very often it takes a special kind of person, and it's used to describe hospice nurses and other people on staff, but we are talking about nurses in this case. As you mentioned, it is exhausting. How do you think this
Mhm.
constant emotional giving shapes the experiences of new hospice nurses? Do you notice changes in their behavior, or are there certain statements that are made that make you think, as a better nurse, this person isn't going to last?
I think a lot of nurses would honestly say that in the first week that they're out in the field. I don't know if I'm cut out for this. Even I said it years into the work. And I think it's because of the overwhelm. You just feel so overwhelmed with life in general, and then the work can be overbearing and hard. I think the joy of hospice nursing is that you get to work with a team and you have the hospice medical director, you have your clinical supervisor, your fellow nurse colleagues, your social workers and chaplain, and even bereavement counselor. That interaction can really help you grow because there's so much to learn in hospice. And even when you think you've learned everything, there's still more. I just think that staying with it, and there is a reason why you were chosen. And I did say this in the book. When you were interviewed to go into hospice nurse, those hospice administrators watched your answers. They looked at your references, the kind of person that you are, and if you're independent, can make decisions on your feet, on your own, because you will be out in the field on your own. You will have access to your team via your cell phone, whether it's texting or calling, but you're going to have to be a person who's independently driven. It's very different from hospital work and working with colleagues in a facility. They are not physically there, your hospice team. You will still have access to them, but you generally will need to have inner courage, inner strength to do this kind of work. It takes time, just like everything else. And so you have to know why you got into hospice so that you can endure these kinds of days where everything seems to be falling apart and chaotic, because sometimes it's going to be that way, especially when you're at a patient's home and you're interacting with family members and the family dynamic is just not good. And you have to be that person to provide guidance that's stable and steady and someone they can rely on, and definitely someone they can truly trust in. It's a tall order. There are already people who think that you can do this work and have confidence in you. Otherwise, you would not have been hired. So take that to heart. You already have inside what it takes to be an awesome hospice nurse. So if I'm talking to a new hospice nurse, that would be my advice.
Sunset Angels really supports the emotional and sounds or even in the spiritual needs that maybe need to be addressed or sit within new nurses. So you give both the practical, reminding people of why did you want to come into this work? What keeps you going? And you also feel that hole that I know many nurses feel in this line of work is, gosh, I'm drained. I'm exhausted. And yet another day, another family, another phone call. And it does challenge you. Maybe I've had enough of this, new nurse or otherwise. This hidden burden that have mentioned, we just discussed the importance of processing grief and finding closure in chapters 13 and 14. But new hospice nurses don't necessarily realize how much unspoken grief accumulates over time. For nurses that are just starting out, how can they navigate this burden so it doesn't become overwhelming? You mentioned talking with your bereavement counselors, even chaplains or your team to help process, especially during interdisciplinary team meetings. Using yourself as an example, what do you do to process?
That's a really good question because being a hospice nurse, you internalize a lot of things and you can't really act upon how you feel in the situation. But when you step out of a patient's home or at the end of the day, you do need to unload somewhere. I have had lots of experience when I've just gone through something very overwhelming and I've asked my fellow social worker colleagues to help me understand or debrief something. And they were more than happy to sit down with me and we would just chat about it. And I would just explain what I'm going through. I felt so much better afterwards. Because if you keep all of this anxiety, maybe the chaos of the day inside, and there's no outlet, you definitely will not be able to sustain this kind of work for a long period of time. So I do a lot of journaling, and lately I have been writing down things that I've learned from my patients, lessons that I've learned personally, and they had no idea that it actually spoke to me as a person. Someday I'd like to write about those lessons that I've learned, but every day find something good that happened to you and write it down. It could be a compliment from a family member. It could be a compliment from a patient. Something that you can look back on and say, hey, I did something that made a difference to someone. It can be a lonely thing out there. If you're out in the field, I enjoy being by myself and just being out there. I used to work in a more city, urban metropolitan area and driving the freeways and just being in that environment. Now I'm in a more rural area where I can see more of nature, cows and goats and turkeys like walking across the road, which is fun. So this is a different type of hospice nursing. Same work, it's just in this different setting. But just finding the joys in your day really does help make a difference. Not only that, but taking a walk, doing some form of exercise that's moving your body. It can make a world of a difference taking even a 10-minute walk. Your outlook on life is so much more different and it benefits you health wise as a person. Those are the things that I do, and there needs to be an outlet. Otherwise, you're just going to say, hey, this is not for me, when it could be a real good option for you in the world of nursing.
Good points, Ellen. Now, new nurses, the biggest challenges to come from patient care, which is true. But there are also challenges in the workplace in terms of culture and administrative support or lack of it, which plays a bigger, I believe, role in their success. In chapter 7, you discuss your team, your support. In your experience, what does true leadership and support look like in hospice care? And what do new nurses look for in a supportive environment?
I think the biggest part that the hospice administrators can play in making the experience of hospice nursing positive is gratitude and helping, especially a new nurse, get to that of confidence where she says, I can do this. But it takes people who are willing to cheer them on. I remember my first clinical supervisor. Her name's Grace Nixon, and she was always available. If I had a question or if I was stuck and I had a problem, I could call her and she would 90% of the time be there for me. And she would answer my questions. She would ask how I was doing. She would listen to me. And I really felt like she was listening and helping me through my issues. Sometimes being out in the field and feeling alone, you unappreciated. It's really important to celebrate your nurses, whether it's on Nurses Week or there's a hospice month that you can celebrate your nurses. I remember times when we had luncheons together and some gifts given. Just feeling like you're treasured and you're appreciated really does help. Also, the workload. If you are working your nurses with caseloads over 20, that is unreasonable for hospice nurses to keep up with. I actually was in a company that expected that of us. So just knowing that the culture of your hospice team or your hospice company is really important. What is it that is expected of them as far as caseloads? Because if it's too high, it's really not sustainable. It's really not healthy physically, emotionally, and spiritually to have a huge caseload. Then expect them to do that for years on end. So you'll begin to see turnover rates increasing. I experienced that and I had to change to a different hospice company who understood the needs of the nurse. So I was able to stay there and actually feel like I had a life. That burnout that I experienced, I found healing through that company. But hospice work is hospice work. It is challenging, it's exhausting. So you will have to find ways to care for yourself and do self-care. It's not an option. It's really something that you have to do.
I like that not being an option because, as we're saying, you have to find ways to sustain yourself, or it seeps into other parts of your life, that stress and the buildup of having to deal with the reality of life, which is the end of life. In your opinion, what do you think a reasonable caseload is?
I would think it would be between 11 to 15. I know that the work of hospice goes in waves. There'll be highs and lows throughout the year, and it's not easy to manage the highs into the 18 and 19s. That's really pushing it. I would think ideally the highest would be maybe 17 or 18 when, the census of the team increases and you have to find ways to get more help and advocate for yourself. Don't suffer in silence. Tell your supervisor what's going on. They want you to be able to manage it. And if you speak up, they will provide help. But if you don't, they will think, oh, she can handle this. But if you're drowning in your work, please speak up. That's what I would say to the new hospice nurse. Don't think that you can grin and bear it. Just get through it. Because if you continue to do that, it's just going to wear you down. And then the work will not be enjoyable at all.
I know you and I worked together at a
Uh-huh.
hospice, and the administrators were very understanding of caseloads and tried to get you all help when the census did peak. But
Mm.
no employers do that. The
No.
nurses, when they're working for an employer, we hear you, we're working on it. And as you mentioned, weeks go by, months go by, years go by. But it's time to call it quits or to look for another employer.
Yeah, actually, I had one regret that I stayed in that position too long where I had over 20 patients. They actually had an LPN for me to work with exclusively so she could help me with my caseload. And that helped a lot, but it didn't help with IDT notes. And then meetings with the hospice medical director when we had visits together. There's a lot of responsibility on the RN that people don't really see. Another thing about hospice nursing is that managing time is really ultra important. Not every patient has the same needs. One patient might need you to handhold and you need to take more time with them. But others who don't need that, just make sure that you're meeting their needs and you don't have to spend extra time with them.
When is enough in terms of your caseload
Yes,
and being heard
right.
by
So what I would say to the new hospice nurses is that when you're finding that your hospice administrators are not listening to your needs and it's affecting you personally as far as your health and your well-being and your family, because there was a point where my daughter and my husband, they saw me overworking and I didn't spend enough time with them. So it affected our relationship. And that's the one thing that I would want to go back and redo. I would not have spent too much time in that company. I spent 5 years there. I probably should have stayed for maybe just 2 or 3. But what kept me was the bond with my team. We worked so well together that I was so hoping for more nurses, but because our caseloads were so high, when we did get new nurses and we would orient them, they would leave because the work was too much and the caseload was too high. So it really didn't help us. And I saw this happening over and over again until one day I said, that's enough. So you personally have to say when it is enough for you, and you have to be truthfully honest. That's what I would encourage for nurses to do.
yeah. So speaking of leaving, I've worked with nurses who they retire and or decided to leave the field just because they've been in it for several years and they're simply exhausted and want to go in other fields of nursing that perhaps isn't emotionally and spiritually draining because you're not day in and day out living and working in the land of the dying. But for those nurses, they found deep meaning in their work, but for some, it becomes even part of their spirituality. What happens when a hospice nurse considers stepping away from the bedside? How would you personally feel about leaving direct care? And how do we help nurses navigate the transition when they do decide while still feeling connected to their purpose? I know you were a full time nurse and now you're a part time nurse that you can do other things in life. What do those feelings look like?
I would say that it is a relief not to be an RN case manager. I've known nurses who have done it for years and into their retirement. I don't know if I could ever do that, but there are other areas within hospice on our team that you could probably do. like being the on-call nurse or the night shift, the assessment, being the triage nurse, or even on our team, we have a pharmacy liaison nurse. She doesn't go to people's homes, but she takes care of all the medication issues that are happening. So if you slot your feet in hospice, but not the day-to-day exhaustion and the taxing of your emotions, then there may be different positions on your team that you would consider. I myself have not stepped out of hospice yet. I know that when working together, I asked you many times, I don't know how long I can do this, but here I am. I'm still in it. I was driving one day back home and I thought of key patients who I've taken care of, namely veterans who I really treasure taking care of them. And my next book will be about caring for veterans.
Yeah.
And I thought I really have dedicated my life to this work.
Well,
I do treasure it. I still treasure it, even on the hard days. And I can say that easier on my days off. There's still something in it for me. I feel like I can offer something to every patient that I work with. And I don't case manage now. I am given an assignment of patients for my days. So I
I
see those patients.
after so many
Hmm.
years, that's refreshing.
It really is.
I remember when we did work together and you'd call and say, Arian, I don't know if it's time. I'm just exhausted. I don't know
Yeah.
what you want.
And it's,
But it seemed as the chaplain, not that I always listened as a chaplain, but I was a chaplain in me. But I always has heard you needing to process and having
mhm,
a safe place to say, I want to quit. It's important
yeah.
to be able to voice your feelings. I am really ready to quit this. But I knew that you were really ready to quit. You just, as you mentioned earlier, to talk things out and talk things through because you have such
Mm-hmm.
a sweet spirit to offer. And although the work is draining, it is fulfilling. It's the weirdest unseen experience in this field of work.
It is. I must say, there are many days that you saved me from utter
Oh, it's
despair.
like,
Then you would tell me words of wisdom, and I would be like, oh, I needed that. That, like I said, is the beauty of hospice that you work with your hospice colleagues, and it actually makes your life richer. Sometimes new nurses tend to turn inward and rely on their own strength, but my advice is to reach out. Even if you know the answer, but you're not sure, ask another nurse or even the social worker because they've probably seen nurses handle difficult situations lots of times. And even chaplains, they actually have been with patients who have told them things that they may not have told you as a nurse. So the chaplain might have insight that you might need. It's the collaboration that I truly enjoy about hospice. And even with doctors, I used to be really intimidated working one-to-one with a doctor. I would call for orders, but hospice medical directors are a different breed of physicians. They listen more. They really do depend on what you tell them, the information about your patients and how to deal with them. They take that information and, of course, give orders, but they can also give you direction and give you advice and guidance as you learn hospice. This really is a collaborative kind of nursing and something that I don't think I've experienced in any other areas of nursing that I've been in. Everyone seems to be on the same plane, and the doctors aren't high up and intimidating or unapproachable. It's just much more a pleasant experience working with doctors in hospice.
yeah,
So
you mentioned in other areas that you've worked in. What are some of the other areas that you've worked in as an RN?
I have done hospital work, and of course, interaction in the hospital with doctors can be challenging depending on their personalities. It's much more brief. You have a problem with a patient, they need to give an order. The interaction is not very long, and you don't get to know him or her. Same with, I've done long-term care facilities, and essentially they don't even come to the facility, or they come later during a different shift when you're not there. So you don't get to see them at all. So it's just a phone call. It's mainly in the hospital and long-term care facilities that I've been in. So I've done telephonic disease management, but I didn't even interact with a physician then. But in hospice, you would see the doctor in meetings, of course, in IDT meetings. And then if there's a luncheon, he or she would come and participate as a hospice team member. They get that emotional connection or supportive connection with their team members that way as well. Because I can't imagine them carrying the whole census of the hospice team. That's a huge responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank,
Ellen, thank you so much.
thank you, Arion, for having me.